So now let's talk about parameters. We're going to add a little bit more to this. Using parameters in your functions, in your custom functions, allows them to be more useful and more powerful. When we design a function, it's really important for us to think of the function as a black box. And what we mean by that is we can't really see what's going on the inside, or we shouldn't have to worry about what's going on the inside. We know that the function does something or that it returns something, and we know the parameters that go into it. But we shouldn't have to worry about how it does what it does or why or how it works inside. What we should be focused on is building a function that if you gave it to somebody else in the class and said, hey, here's this function, here's are the parameters that you give it, and here's what it does. Just like those function reference pages that I keep showing you whenever I introduce a new function, every time I show you one of those, I kind of give you that same information. You don't worry about how print works, right? You don't worry about how input works. You just know this is what it requires you to put in there, and this is what it does. So when you write a function, that's sort of the standard. You want people to be able to reuse that function, knowing what they put in and what it's supposed to do. So here is a function with parameters. It's very similar to what we just looked at, right? The do welcome function. And this time it takes a parameter. That parameter is called str message. A parameter is a variable that is defined when the function is created and given a value at the beginning of that function. Now that variable lives inside the function only, right? So a function is like Vegas. What happens in the function stays in the function, right? If you define a variable in the function, if you define a parameter in the function, that stays in the function. So nowhere else in your program can you access str message. That lives only in the function. But what it does is it allows us, when we create the function, to define a message, to give it a string, and you'll see that that string is then used as part of that function. Which what that means is I can change that welcome message on the fly every time I call that function. So when I call that function, do welcome, I say happy birthday, that goes into that parameter and gets printed. Now, this is called the parameter. The parameter is the variable that gets created. The value of that variable is called an argument. So it might seem as though I'm using those two words interchangeably, but they kind of go together. This is the keyhole, this is the key, if that makes sense. Okay, so an argument goes into a parameter slot. So let's take this code and run that as soon as I fix the formatting from my copy and paste work here. Okay, so there is that code, and again we have str message, which gets printed right here. So when I give it this parameter, then that becomes part of that execution of that function. But the nice thing about that is that every time I call that function now, I can give it a different value, and then that function will substitute that value into that spot in the code so that it does what it needs to do. So that gives it a little bit more power. And all I need to know about do welcome, I don't need to worry about what's in there or how it works. I need to know what it does. It prints out a fancy message. And I need to know what's the parameter that it takes. Well, the parameter is str message. And I can see that that's a string. And I don't have to worry about all of this. Now I could have 1,000 lines of code inside this function that do all kinds of fancy things. And if I just know what it does and I know the parameters that it takes, I don't have to worry about that. So it simplifies your code, and it simplifies coding for other people.